Hey there. Ready for a deep dive into a real classic?
Mm,
We're going back to 1982, The World of Fast Times at Ridgemont High.
awesome.
You guys have sent us some seriously cool stuff about this movie.
Yeah.
We're going way beyond just like your typical 80s teen movie nostalgia.
Right.
Like we're talking about how this movie got made, the surprising backstory,
Yeah.
and why people are still talking about it today.
Still resonates. Yeah.
And to help us break it all down, we've got a film expert with us today. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, it really does hold a special place, I think, in film history. But I got to ask you, it's based on a true story.
Right.
I always figured Hollywood just took the high school experience and just went crazy with it.
Took it to 11, yeah.
Yeah.
You think about those crazy characters, and it's easy to assume that it's all, made up for the screen.
Right.
But the film is actually based on a book by Cameron Crowe called Fast Times at Ridgemont High. A true story.
Okay, so tell me about this book. How does a book about real high schoolers become a movie like Fast Times?
Well, this is where it gets really fascinating, actually. So Crowe, he was just 22 years old at the time.
Wow, okay.
He goes undercover at a real San Diego high school, Claremont High.
Really?
Doesn't just observe from afar, he fully immersed himself in that world. Like, he blended in with the students,
Wow.
got to know their lives, their slang, everything.
Talk about dedication.
It's incredible. He even became friends with a student there named Andy Rathbone, who ended up being the inspiration for the character Ratner.
Wow. So Crow, he wasn't just writing about high school. He was living it.
Exactly.
That explains why the things they say, the dialogue, it feels so real. It wasn't just some Hollywood writer trying to imagine what teenagers sounded like back then.
Exactly, and I think that authenticity is a huge part of why the film still resonates today. It captures that, universal truth about being a teenager, the awkwardness, the excitement, the anxiety, in a way that just feels really relatable even decades later.
Okay, so you've got this, incredibly authentic portrayal of high school. And then you get to the casting. And Sean Penn as Bacoli.
Yeah.
Legendary.
Oh, absolutely. Sean Penn's performance, it's iconic. But what's interesting is that Matthew Broderick was actually the first choice for the role of Spicoli.
Oh.
Yeah.
Ferris Bueller as Bacoli.
Right.
That's a thought.
It really makes you wonder how different the film would have been, what the tone of it would have been with Broderick in that role.
Oh, totally. And we can't forget, Nicolas Cage makes his film debut in this movie.
That's right. Credited as Nicholas Coppola at the time.
Wow.
Talk about an early glimpse at a future Oscar winner. But, it wasn't all smooth sailing for Fast Times.
Oh, really?
The film actually received an X rating initially.
An X rating? Wait, for a teen movie?
I know, right?
What was so scandalous about it?
Well, Universal Pictures was very hesitant about the film because of its content. Remember, it's the early 80s, and Fast Times, it was pushing boundaries. It dealt with topics like teenage sexuality and even abortion with a level of realism that was pretty uncommon for teen movies back then.
It definitely wasn't your typical squeaky clean teen comedy.
It definitely wasn't. And Amy Heckerling, the director, she actually had to fight to keep the film's authenticity. She had to agree to cut some scenes to get an R rating and appease the studio.
So in a way, the studio's hesitation is kind of a testament to how groundbreaking Fast Times was. It was challenging the conventions of what a teen movie could be.
Absolutely, and it really paved the way for more realistic and nuanced portrayals of teenage life in film.
It really did set a new standard for honesty in these teen movies, for sure.
It did.
And it's interesting you mentioned that the studio, they were kind of freaking out a little bit about some of the more, I guess, mature themes and topics. But when I think about those scenes, even the ones that are dealing with some heavier stuff, it never felt like they were trying to be edgy or anything. It's like the film found a way to be honest about these experiences without being too over the top.
Exactly, and I think that's really a testament to Amy Heckerling, the director, and her ability to find that balance.
Right.
She wasn't afraid to show the realities of teenage life.
Right.
But she did it with a lot of sensitivity and heart.
Yes.
Take the storyline with Stacy's pregnancy, for example. It's handled with such care.
Totally.
And it doesn't shy away from the complexity of the issue.
It's so different from that stereotypical, very special episode kind of thing that we used to see in the 80s and 90s.
Oh, absolutely. You're exactly right. It avoids that preachy after-school special vibe,
Totally.
and instead it just presents the characters' experiences in a way that feels really authentic and
And
relatable.
it starts a conversation, right? It
Exactly.
doesn't try to shut it down.
Exactly. And speaking of starting conversations, can we talk about the soundtrack?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's practically a character in itself.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can't hear moving in stereo without picturing Phoebe Cates in slow motion, like by the pool.
Iconic. Or somebody's baby playing during that scene in the bathroom. The soundtrack really does such a good job of capturing the energy and the anxieties of being a teenager.
It really does. It's such a perfect, like, time capsule of early 80s music. From, like, the Go-Go's to, like, Tom Petty to Led Zeppelin. It's got it all.
It does.
And just takes you right back. And it makes you realize that even though the movie takes place at a very specific time, so many of those feelings of just being young and figuring things out, they're totally timeless.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned that because even though Fast Times is rooted in the early 80s, it continues to connect with audiences across generations. Why do you think that is? Like, what gives this film such staying power?
That's a great question. Part of it, I think, is the characters. Even though they're dealing with these, like, very specific situations, there's something so universal about what they go through. Like, everyone's been the new kid at school trying to figure out where they fit in. Everybody's had that crush that, like, consumes their every thought.
Totally. And those themes of first love and heartbreak, peer pressure, trying to figure out who you are,
Right.
those are timeless and universal.
Yeah.
They really transcend any specific time period.
It's funny, even the stuff that seems, like, super dated now, like, what they're wearing, how they're talking.
Right.
It just adds to the charm of the film. It's become this weird blend of nostalgia and timelessness.
Absolutely. But I think beyond just the nostalgia factor, Fast Times endures because at its core, it's about real people. These characters feel so authentic.
They do.
They have flaws, they make mistakes, they're funny, they're frustrating, but they're always relatable.
And you're rooting for them.
You are.
Even when they're, like, making kind of questionable choices.
And exactly. You're like, come on, you got this. You can figure it out, even if it means stumbling along the way a little bit.
Right, exactly.
And that's a testament to the writing, to the directing, and of course to the performances. Which, it brings us back to the casting.
Yeah.
It's just mind-blowing to think about how different this film could have been with those other actors in those roles.
Can you imagine, like, Tom Hanks playing Brad? Like, the uptight older brother.
Right.
It's so hard to picture anyone but Judge Reinhold in that role.
I know. It makes you wonder if those alternate casting choices would have just completely changed the movie.
Totally.
Would it have been as successful? It's so fascinating to think about.
Yeah, it really is. So we've been talking a lot about the film, but they did a TV show too, right? Did you ever see the Fast Times TV show?
I've seen a few episodes.
Okay.
I can't say I revisit them very often.
Yeah, I get that. Even people who love the movie don't really seem to talk about the show very much. It's like this weird little footnote in the whole Fast Times story.
Totally. And you know what? It goes to show, I think, sometimes some stories are best left as they are.
Right. Yeah.
The magic of that original film, it's really something special.
It really is. It's like trying to catch lightning in a bottle or something,
Totally.
But speaking of, how we remember this movie, it's so interesting, right? Like, it went from being this kind of controversial, even scandalous film to a total classic.
Right.
Why do you think that is? What is it about this movie that helped it last all this time?
That's a great question. And I think there are a few things,
Yeah.
First, there's the humor. Fast Times is really, really funny. And a lot of that humor, it still works.
Totally.
The characters are so quirky and relatable, and the situations they're in, even if they're, very 80s, there's that timeless awkwardness that I think anybody who's ever been a teenager can relate to.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, who hasn't sat in Mr. Hand's history class and just been like, this is my life right now?
Totally. And beyond the humor, there's a real heart to this film. These characters, they have flaws, they make bad choices sometimes, but they're ultimately good kids who are just trying to find their way.
Yeah.
And that journey, of figuring yourself out, navigating friendships and relationships, and the pressure of growing up.
Right.
It resonates. It doesn't matter what decade you grew up in,
Totally. It's interesting you say that because you're talking about how they make mistakes and stuff. And I'm thinking about how Fast Times doesn't shy away from showing what happens when they mess up.
Right.
Like with Stacy's pregnancy, I mean, that's a huge deal.
Absolutely.
It's not like brushed aside.
No, it's a turning point in the film.
Yes.
And it shows, like, the very real challenges that teenagers face.
Totally. And that's another reason why this movie has lasted, I think.
Yeah.
It doesn't talk down to its audience. Like, even younger viewers, it treats them with respect.
Yeah.
It doesn't try to pretend that these things don't exist.
It's honest, you know?
Yeah.
And sensitive.
Totally. And again, it goes back to starting those conversations.
Yeah.
It doesn't try to tell you what to think.
Right.
So we've talked about so much. Cameron Crowe sneaking into high school.
Yeah, can you imagine?
I know.
Yeah.
All the controversy. And then how much people still connect with this movie. But there's one last thing I keep wondering about.
What's that?
Do you think Fast Times, this story, so 80s, do you think it would connect with teenagers today?
Oh, that is the question, isn't it?
It really is.
And honestly, I think so. I mean, yeah, some of the references might be lost on them, the fashion, totally dated.
Oh, for sure.
But at its heart, Fast Times is about being a teenager, and that's universal.
Yeah.
The awkwardness, the excitement,
Yeah.
first love, heartbreak.
Right.
Every generation goes through that.
It's true.
Yeah.
And in a way, maybe seeing it set in the 80s, maybe that makes it even more powerful now, because it's like, see? Even back then.
Exactly.
It's a good reminder that we've all been through it.
Yeah.
Even if we had different haircuts when we did it.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
So there you have it, folks. Our deep dive into Fast Times at Ridgemont High, a movie that, even after 40 years, is still entertaining, still thought-provoking.
Still relevant.
If you want to go even deeper, and I know you do, check out the Criterion Collection Edition. It's got all kinds of behind-the-scenes stuff. Seriously cool stuff.
It's amazing.
Who knows, maybe after this you'll be inspired to revisit Ridgemont High yourselves. Until next time.